Welcome everyone. My name's Philip Murphy. I'm now Director of History and Policy, which has just moved back to its original home in the Institute of Historical Research. It was founded partly by Pat Thane back in 2002 with colleagues from Cambridge. It migrated over to King's College, and it has just as of January this year come back to the IHR, and I've taken over as director, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be associated with History and Policy. It's a unique network that links professional historians, over 500 professional historians in the UK, to policymakers at central government, local government level, in international organizations, in business, and particularly for our purposes today, got fantastic links with the trade union movement through the Trade Union and Employment Forum, which John Edmonds chairs for us. And I'm very grateful to John and to Jim Moher for suggesting this event to us.
Michael,
it's the first online event that we've hosted at the IHR since the move to the IHR. We've already got over 100 people in the room, and that's, I think, a mark of the strength of the network and the interest in this extraordinary new book, Walter Citrine, Forgotten Statesman of the TUC by Jim Moher, which is going to be the subject of discussion today. And before I kind of introduce John Edmonds properly, just a little plug again for History and Policy. We're starting to think how he's gonna work from the IHR. We're really open to ideas and suggestions. For those of you who are historians, we continue to run our policy papers series, which is a sort of short policy orientated report on a historical subject. We run opinion pieces. We publish short books. We run all sorts of events. Please get in touch if you have ideas that you can bring to us, and you can think of ways in which History and Policy can play a part in bringing really good history, really effective history to the policy-making process. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to John Edmonds, who is, as all of you will know, former General Secretary of the GMB, one of Britain's 3 largest trade unions. He was General Secretary from 1986 to 2003, and he is Chairman of our Trade Union Forum for History and Policy. John, thank you so much, and over to you.
Well, okay, Philip. First, a mutual thank you to you and to Gemma for helping to set up this occasion, this event. For those of you who haven't yet worked out where you are, this is the launch of Jim Moher's new book on Walter Citrine, The Forgotten Statesman of the TUC. And as Philip has already said, I chair the Trade Union and Employment Forum of History and Policy, and we are sponsoring this event, and I'm going to chair this evening. Well, to business then. Walter Citrine was, of course, General Secretary of the TUC, and in the first part of this evening, we are going to have Jim Moher, the author, interviewed by John Monks about Citrine's work and his career. That'll probably go, and then we'll move into questions and to general discussion. Walter Citrine's career covered the interwar war period and much of, in fact, of the 20th century. So he was involved in so much that was going on, so there's much to discuss. First of all, then, a word about the author. When Jim came to Ireland, from Ireland to Britain, he worked on building sites to raise money for his union. He started his trade union career with the T&G and then became an official with the Communications Union. And after a range of senior posts, he moved on to being appointed as the national political officer of, I think this is probably his dream job. And he certainly at this time helped to achieve Labour's comeback from that terrible Thatcherite wilderness in the 1980s. Jim retired in 2006. During his trade union career, he was also an active councillor in Brent, so a lot of grassroots political experience. And in what was left of his spare time, he gained a PhD. Now, Jim wears his scholarship lightly, but Jim is really Dr. James Moher. So I want to give it for that. Then on to John Monks, who's going to be in conversation with Jim. John, as everybody here will know, was General Secretary of the TUC from 1993 into 2003. And then he became Secretary of the European TUC and held that post until 2011. That means that for nearly 20 years, he held two of the most important posts in the trade union world. And very soon after he retired from the ETUC, he was made a life peer and also became a Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur, a particular tribute to his European work. Well, recording John Monk's achievements would take most of the evening, but many people here will want to be reminded that for part of his time, he was the chair of the trustees of the People's History Museum in his home city of Manchester. Now, I hope John has been admitted. They're going to turn over to you to begin the discussion with Jim Moher. John Monks.
Thank you very much, John, for that introduction. And can I congratulate Jim Moher, first of all, on a terrific achievement, writing a book of considerable scholarship, but in a very lively fashion. And I've been very much enjoying reading it, Jim. And I hope other people will get the same pleasure out of it and knowledge out of it that I have done. And I'd read the two volumes of autobiography that Citrine himself had written in the 60s and early 70s. So I'm going to introduce a few themes around Citrine and around the TUC, and I'm not going to say too much, and then I'm going to invite Jim to comment on each of them in turn. But before we get into the man's work at the TUC, Jim, can you tell us why you decided to write this book, take on this pretty huge assignment that you've done in such a way that comes across as a labor of love? So why the book?
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. But thank you, John, first of all, for the introduction, and to John Edmonds. I'm very honored to have such former senior trade union leaders as John Edmonds and John Monks supporting my launch tonight. And of course, John has written a foreword to the book. I'm also very grateful to Professor Murphy, Philip Murphy, and Gemma Doma of the IHR for the way they facilitated what is quite a major exercise now. And we've had over 160 people registering. Obviously, not all of them will come in, but a lot of them have. And so I'd also like to thank you all, my friends, colleagues in many roles over the years, from my family, from the union, from the Labour Party, from Brent Council and academia. Also, a number of people from abroad, from Ireland, Canada, and Australia. All welcome, and I hope that we'll give you value for money tonight. So, why the book? I've always been interested in labour and trade union history, and over the course of my career, but I hit on Citrine by accident, funnily enough. Somebody asked me to do a bit of research for them in the LSE, where there was an archive from Citrine's works. And I found this humongous, massive files. Yeah. And so I thought, this is something we're going to have a closer look at. He had such a long career, ranging over 6 decades, and he documented most of it with shorthand writing, which he then had translated by the TUC. And so it's all there, ranging from a varied career as an electrician in Merseyside, a union official on Merseyside, then the TUC Assistant General Secretary and General Secretary from 1926 to 46, President of the International Federation of Trade Unions at Amsterdam, 1928 to 1945, and then finally, when he left the TUC, as chair of the British Electricity Authority, one of the nationalized industries, from 1947 to 1958. So, I mean, it's amazing his span of activity and his longevity. And I thought, this man deserves a write-up. Obviously from Liverpool, but he left it at the age of 32 with regret, because he loved the Mersey. First to Manchester as a national official, an elected national official of the Electricians Union, where he, I'll tell you more about that, then to London, and he lived in Harrow and Wembley for most of their lives here, 1924 to 1973, before he retired when his wife died. He retired to Brixham in Devon, where he spent the last years of his life until he was 95. So incredible career, and also a real Marco Polo as the international president of the unions in Amsterdam, Berlin, Paris, during World War II, to Moscow and Russia, to New York, to USA, Canada, all over Europe. And you can imagine in those days of the infancy of air power, and also the U-boat risks in sailing. It was quite a hazardous operation, going thousands of miles, and yet he had the courage to undertake various union duties in that. So I was invited to do a chapter by my friends Alistair Reid and Peter Ackers in 2016, which I did for a book called Alternatives to State Socialism. And they encouraged me afterwards. They said, look, this does deserve a full biography. Because I took that on, silly me, quite a task in many ways. But it's also a fascinating period of history, the 1920s to the 1940s. And to view it through the lens of someone like Citrine, so closely involved in major events, was quite a challenge, but I thought it would make a very good book. So it is time for the biography of a prominent union leader. There's been so few, and Bevan has had 5 or 6, of course, but I think it gives a more rounded picture of the trade union world of that period, which was a mainly manual working class group. But also, I wanted to set the record straight. Citrine has had a bad press because he was involved in many controversies, political controversies and otherwise. But as I'll unfold the story, he was also, a lot of his good points were distorted or ignored or forgotten. And so I think it's important to set the record straight, even now, even so long out, because it's important to the trade unions that they have a clear, I think, a better picture of their past and of the significant role which people like Citrine played. But clearly, it's not just a trade union study. It's also about this character from Merseyside, and the other historical figures like Ernie Bevan, Arthur Cook, Nye Bevan, Harry Pollitt from the Communists, and Arthur Horma. So I tried to bring in all those people in one way or another. And I hope you'll find that I've managed it okay in the book. Thank you, John.
Well, thanks for that, Jim, and thanks for the reasons why you embarked on this this operation. And there's a lot of fascinating stories and anecdotes in there, not just about the trade union leaders whose names you mentioned, but about the politicians of the day, both Labour and in the government and in the Conservative Party, Baldwin and Churchill in particular. Anyway, I'm going to briefly introduce a number of themes in order. I'm going to ask you after each one just to give it your response, and you'll fill out some of the details that concern them. And my first area is the relationship between the TUC and its affiliated unions. After all, Citrine comes down from the Northwest, and he's more or less straight into the general strike, first AGS and then as General Secretary. And he's got the issue that he'd identified before when he was an ETU official, that the TUC's central authority was quite weak, and unions were jealously guarded their autonomy and didn't really want the TUC telling them what to do. And yet the mood of the time, and Citrine shared it, was he was a syndicalist. He did believe in united action. He did believe very much in using the strike for political ends at that stage of his life. And the conflict that was in him is, and as to a certain degree has been all through the TUC's history since, seems to me to be an important one. So the relations, Jim, between the TUC and affiliates, the general strike obviously was a seminal moment. The relationships with Ernest Bevin were also important, and the relationships with some of the communists and the national minority movement.
Sure.
The breakaways. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, John, if I may take a liberty of taking you back, first of all, to Merseyside, in terms of who he was and what he did before he came to TUC. There's a lot of people here from the Northwest who might be interested, and everybody I'm sure will be interested if I tell you. The name Citrine was an Italian, the Lemon Grove workers, and his great-grandfather came from Italy, and they settled in London and then in Liverpool. But his father was a ship's rigger and a pilot on the Mersey, quite a skilled job, but frequently unemployed. He also had a drink problem. And his mother, who was a visiting nurse, she more or less kept the family going with her earnings. She comes from a strong Scottish Arbroath Presbyterian family, and his middle name, McClellan, that was her maiden name. So Citrine developed as a very upright, serious-minded and disciplined individual. He had 5 brothers and sisters, and sadly, his mother, sister, and a stepbrother died of TB, what he called the scourge of the Citrines, which gives you a flavor of the Liverpool of that time and the conditions in many of our cities. But he was born in 1887 in Liverpool, but he grew up in Seacombe, Wallasey, in the Wirral from the age of 2. He left school at 12 and got a job in a dusty mill, which nearly killed him. He had serious inflammation of the lungs and kidney. And so they were worried that he wouldn't live, but he did. And his mother said, it was your spirit which kept me alive. And I think he had that in Barrowfalls. He was also self-taught, like a lot of good trade union leaders of that time, what they called autodidacts. And he was fortunate that in Liverpool, they had the Picton reading room, which was books on the shelves and enabled to access for ordinary working class people. He schooled himself in literary classics. He was a great Shakespeare fan. He was a great Dickens fan. And so he had quite a rounded education, as well as being an electrician and so on. But he started as an ETU, electrical trade union activist, from 1911, when there was a general strike in Liverpool. It probably brought him into things. And he applied himself, like he did in every job he took on, learning the rule books, He had his shorthand to take notes of everything. He led a number of strikes, and in 1914, he was elected as the district secretary for the Merseyside area for 3 branches. And so he became a leading light in the region in the course of the First World War. And he was quite militant, quite strong. He was also secretary and president of the engineering and shipbuilding trades. So quite a strong, I mean, people talk about Citrine as if he was a bureaucrat. He had a very strong organic trade union pedigree. And his biggest claim to fame actually was his involvement in the police strike of 1919, which was hugely controversial because when the police withdrew their labor, the rioters began and there was a weekend of rioting. So his reputation in supporting the strike was challenged. The other distinctive thing, of course, which Citrine is best known for, his ABC of chairmanship. Now that started out as notes for his electricians on the Mersey, turned into a book called The Labour Chairman, and it was guidance on how to conduct a meeting, guidance on how to make your points of order and stuff. It's still, the book is still extinct, and Alan Johnson, who I'm sorry couldn't make it here for technical reasons, he talks about it. It was his education, and there's a lot more in the trade union movement who will talk of Citrine as their Bible. And so that was, I think, his background. And I wanted to, I'm sorry that I deflected from your question, John, but I am coming on to it. But I wanted to give people a feeling of the man and where he came from and what made him tick, because too often he's been described as a bureaucrat and an apparatchik and what have you, whereas completely untrue. Obviously, he developed the TUC and modernized their administration, modernized their filing systems, and cultivated, built a cadre of motivated, talented individuals who were a team with which he worked throughout his life. Many of them became general secretaries of the TUC afterwards, like George Woodcock. But he developed this split the corps, which serviced the trade union movement so well. But coming on to the affiliates, he arrived in the TUC in 1924, but fortuitously, he was then in an administrative role. But his boss, a guy called Fred Bramley, died within a year. And so he was given the job of acting general secretary. You can imagine 1925, it was the year just before the general strike. So he was actually pitched into the biggest dispute of the century. And it's a very complex, many-sided affair, which still divides union and political opinion as we approach the 100th anniversary of 1926. But affiliates like the Miners' Union, which you asked, they wanted to use the TUC as a rallying and support center, obviously, but they didn't want it to surrender any of their autonomy in the question of calling strikes or when to call them off, when to negotiate. They weren't, and this is one of the core issues that ran through the general strike. They were on the verge a number of times of settling it, but the miners either weren't in town or they weren't prepared to do a deal. And so the TUC was left with egg on its face. And so it went on. But I'm not getting into that. What the book has is sort of culling from Citrine's own account. And he had a bird's eye view. He sat on the General Council. He was secretary to the negotiating team that met Baldwin and the cabinet, that met the miners' leaders. And so he was in such a first-hand position. And I think his account stands up to scrutiny even after so many years. Now, the scale of that strike, over 2 million workers left work in the course of the 9 days. And so it was a tremendous activity altogether. Fortunately, the weather was good in the month of May. And so it was good humor. There was very little major incidents, although there were some and so on. And as I say, you will not get agreement even to this day as to how that strike went and why it went and so on, because a lot of the evidence is lost. But what was important, the TUC had to call off the strike after 9 days. They felt that the miners would not let them negotiate a deal. And so they said, right, well, we're going to have to pull it, because 9 days was a tremendous length of time anyway for a general strike. So they did so, but they did so in a way that wasn't very satisfactory, because there was confusion as to the terms on which it was going to be called off. And a lot of people were left vulnerable to employers' victimization and what have you. So there was a lot of recrimination about the thing, but I'm not going to get into that tonight. But what was important was that it was a turning point. It was a lesson for Citrine and Ernie Bevin as to the limitations of union power. They never intended a revolution or a challenge to the state, but that's how it came to be seen by the government and the press. But there were groups who actually did see it like that. The communists, a lot of syndicalists, and they saw it as the start of a revolution. And through their front organization, the minority movement, they sought to take over the union leaderships afterwards. But Citrine, who was now the substantive general secretary, he felt so strongly about this threat to produce a written expose called Democracy or Disruption. He posed the question starkly, whether the cancer of communist influence is to be allowed to grow, as it was doing in the split labor movement in Germany. The TUC Annual Congress of 1927-1928 and the vast majority of major unions answered that question by isolating the communists and the minority movement in their organizations. Now, that's quite important because it kept the unions united as the basis for a recovery. They didn't split like they could have done, like in Germany or France. And I think that was a major achievement coming out of the general strike.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think on the general strike we could talk all night. Actually, it's what we to leave out in this introduction conversation that and allowing the others to come in a bit later on.
Yes.
I mean that was one major problem. What an overture to his career that was, and of course he had a mental breakdown soon after that. In this era, when people talk more frankly about mental problems, he had a nervous breakdown.
Yes.
And he was sent on a cruise, wasn't he, by the general?
That was a little bit later, 1930. But I'll come on to that.
Okay, but just let me move you on then to the relationship between the TUC, its affiliated unions, and the Labour Party and its affiliated unions, of course.
Yes, indeed.
A lot. And Lewis Minkin, who sadly died in the last few days, academic who's written about that relationship, called it the contentious alliance. He tried to ascertain how to get this thing to work better than perhaps it had done historically. So when did it work well, this relationship? And when did it work badly? Well, what was Citrine's role in all that?
Well, certainly not immediately. The first Labour government, of course, was 1924, was a very slim minority government. And the second one was 1929 to 31. Both of these were pretty disappointing or disastrous experiences in the case of the last one, which we explore in detail in the book. But Citrine pressed for, as a result of those experiences, his key complaint about MacDonald, the Prime Minister, was their failure to consult, their failure to actually listen to the unions. And MacDonald was a very remote Prime Minister who was focused on foreign affairs more than, but there was a lot of bad relations, for instance, between Bevin and MacDonald over strikes in the 1924, during the 1924 government. And so there wasn't a very satisfactory arrangement at all. But Citrine's alternative and his proposal was that, look, we should have an open relationship. We shouldn't pretend that we don't influence the Labour Party. We do. We founded the Labour Party. But at the same time, we've got to listen to the parliamentarians and the leaders and their point of perspective. So what we need is a continuous, ongoing series of liaisons and discussions where we trash out problems ahead of when we come to them. And that way, Labour governments would be in a far better position to conduct themselves and to have a successful administration. So he set this up in 1931. Coming back to your point about his nervous breakdown, this happened in 1930. He said he was overworked, and he did. His doctor actually went to the General Council and said, look, you've got to send this man on a cruise, otherwise he'll be dead. And of course, there was a long history of General Secretaries who did die, including Fred Bramley in office. So they sent him for 6 months on a cruise in 1930, which took him out of the action for more than 6 months, because of course you don't recover from a nervous breakdown so easily. So he was well out of for most of the 31 period as well, even though he was there. I don't think he had much influence. It was Bevin who had most of the influence. But coming on to the National Council of Labour, as it was called, from 1934, it proved a game changer. Even though the parliamentarians, including Clem Attlee, weren't too happy with the idea of the General Council having so much influence on policy, they had no alternative, because MacDonald had done such a bad thing to defect. They were contrite. And so there was a good liaison. But the key issue during the 30s was, of course, the traditional pacifist stand of the Labour Party. And understandably, in the case of, it was so soon after the First World War and the carnage of the First World War, lots of pacifist sentiment about. But Citrine took the view, look, I've seen Hitler in action in Berlin, where the IFTU executive met, and he saw the rise of the Nazis. He saw what they did to the trade unions. They just tore them out by the roots. They tore out the Labour Party, the cooperative movement, and Germany had the biggest Labour movement in Europe. So his point was, look, you've got to fight. A dictator only understands a military answer, and therefore we should rearm. And in the end, and particularly after the Spanish Civil War, I think the parliamentary leadership came to agree and see it in the same light. And so they were united. One writer who I quoted, to sum up the thing, he said, the unions assumed a pivotal role in shaping the Labour Party's direction. By 1940, its political culture, organization, and policy had been decisively made. So they had a substantial social democratic policy in preparation for the 1945 government. That was a young scholar by the name of James Parker, by the way, who I think is here tonight. And I must thank him for his very interesting study of the political culture of the British Labour Party. So that was one side of it. The other side of it was, of course, the Labour left, what was called the Socialist League at that time, led by Stafford Cripps, Clement Attlee, and Nye Bevan. They wanted to ally with this Communist Party in a united front against fascism. But Citrine's experience and knowledge of the role of the CP in Germany, which split the working class, in his view, and his reports to the General Council spelled this out. They deeply distrusted having anything to do with the Communist Party. And of course, in Britain, it didn't matter anyway, because they were a tiny group. But it was important. Nye Bevan, who afterwards became a saint, got so many things wrong at that period that it was amazing that he continued to have such a following. But of course, that's another story. Stop there, John.
Yeah, thank you, Because Citrine always believed the TUC should be close to Labour, but should also be autonomous and have not follow blindly to in the wake of whatever the Labour leadership wanted. And we've tackled that problem subsequently by liaison arrangements, particularly in the 1970s after the debacle of In Place of Strife, the white paper of that time, and so on. But we've never quite got that right, and that's a problem I've left for my successors, I think. as well as Walter Citrine probably had a very successful time at times in the 30s, and of course also during the Second World War. Anyway, my next theme is, I mean, Labour only in power for those short periods you mentioned. Mostly the Conservative Party were in power. And tell us about his relationship with the government of the day, with the leading figures, Churchill and Stanley Baldwin, perhaps in particular.
Yes. Well, from the start, Citrine's particular stamp on the TUC was that it should be independent of all parties. He remained a strong Labour man throughout his life, but he felt that the TUC was a broader body than the Labour Party, and should be independent enough to be able to say so to all the party leaders. And interestingly, his view of the general strike also was that it wasn't a complete failure. He used to say, we put the wind up them, meaning the establishment, because when 2 million people took strike action for 9 days, they were sending messages to the establishment, which were received, particularly shrewd Tory governments like Stanley Baldwin. And so they developed a better relationship after the strike. They did initially pass a vindictive law penalizing the unions for the general strike, things like the Labour Party funding they attacked. And they also wouldn't allow the public service unions or the local government unions to affiliate to the TUC or the Labour Party. And that caused a lot of grief right through to 1945 when it was repealed. But Citrine's perspective was very different from what it had been before 1926. And indeed, Ernie Bevan's perspective was very similar. The Ministry of Labour under Baldwin's encouraged collective bargaining, and it encouraged industry-wide agreements. The TUC met the large employers. It was called the Mond-Turner Talks, and they found an increasingly and surprising amount of consensus. So Citrine's definitive quote about that process, he called it the next step in industrial relations. He said, trade unionism has reached the end of a definite stage of evolution. It has become a power in the land with a growing consciousness of purpose to which increased responsibilities and obligations cannot fail to be attached. And that was quite a strategic perspective, and was why the TUC were able to converse with governments and indeed negotiate with governments to achieve the kind of recognition of trade unions. Unfortunately, the Great Depression in 1929 onwards cut across all of that. But throughout the 1930s, and recovery started in the mid-1930s, Citrine regularly met all the prime ministers, Baldwin, Chamberlain, MacDonald, and they all valued his balanced and direct representations. He wasn't afraid to tell them their views, but he also listened and negotiated. To the point, 1936, when Baldwin was in the middle of his greatest crisis, the abdication, he invited Citrine to Chequers to ask him, what did the trade unions think? And Citrine told him, well, look, we're with you on this one because we feel that the constitutional position, the monarch has to conduct themselves in the manner to which the government feel they should do. Also, on the rearmament debates, they made a big impact on the Labour Party. First of all, it'd be discussed at the TUC, then the National Council of Labour, then the Labour Party. So Citrine had a big, even though he wasn't a politician, he had a big influence through the TUC with all governments, including the Labour government.
Yes, thanks, Jim. I've got a couple of
John,
questions.
I just wonder whether, I mean, I'm sure there has been so much thought about the issues that have been raised so far. I wonder whether just one more theme, and then I'll ask colleagues to join in the debate.
Yes,
Yes.
John, okay, for sure. Just a quick answer, Jim, if it's possible, on the international work that Citrine did. You did talk earlier on about his experience in Berlin, but he was a key figure, along with Ernest Bevin, in building up the International Labour Organization. He was a key figure in building up the International Federation of Trade Unions. As you said earlier, he traveled very, very widely, and he was extremely well informed. I mean, I was astonished to learn at one time that he went to Finland after Finland was invaded by the Red Army, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. These kind of initiatives that he took in hazardous conditions. Tell us a bit more about what he did internationally, and then we'll pass back to John.
Well, he became president of the International Federation of Trade Unions in 1928. And this was a time when, of course, events were moving towards the rise of Hitler in Germany. And ironically, the International Federation executive met in Berlin from 1931 to 1933. So he had, again, a first-hand view of the rise of the Nazis. And one of the things he developed, he became a bit of a Cassandra, warning the country, even before Churchill, of the dangers of Nazism and Hitler. And he set up in New York and London an anti-fascist council, which would seek to get across to all classes, not just the working class, the dangers. And so they had big meetings at the Albert Hall, and Churchill addressed them, and other big figures of the time. And they were hugely successful. And I stress, the unity of the trade union movement was one of the big influences which isolated Mosley and the fascists in Britain. They originally had Northcliffe on their back, in their support, but Citrine's influence, I think, there. And ironically, when Citrine went to America in 1940 to discuss isolationism with the American unions, Churchill gave him an introduction to Roosevelt, which said, Citrine worked with me 3 years before the war in an effort to arouse all parties in the country to the need of rearmament against Germany. So that was, and I know I've got to be short, but that was so important that Churchill realized his role. And he said, at the present time, he fills a position in the labor movement more important to the conduct of the war than many ministerial offices. He has the root of the matter with him. And so his meetings with Roosevelt, we go into in the book as well. And also we go into his Russian experiences. But I'll stop there because I know John wants to bring in other people.
Well, thanks, Jim. That concludes this introductory conversation. I hope for everybody on the line that it's whetted your appetite to get the book, and I hope also to join in the subsequent discussion. It's an excellent book. I commend it thoroughly to everybody. Over to you, John.
And so do I. Colleagues, people who are familiar with the Zoom process would know that in the tab along the bottom, there's reactions. Click on that, you can put a yellow hand up to indicate you want to come in. I'd be grateful if you did it that way. We've got over 120 people here. So the second plea is that people who have the good luck to contribute, contribute briefly and briskly. So who's going to be the first contributor? I've seen John Evans. John? No?
Yeah, thanks. Just unmuting. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can.
What was his relationship like with Keynes? You read a lot about Bevan and Keynes and the May Report and the opposition to it and so on, but did Citrine himself have a relationship with John Maynard Keynes, and a work one?
Shall I answer?
Please.
Yes, in fact, a very close one. He admired Keynes greatly. He thought he was the foremost economist. And particularly he read Keynes's book, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, in 1925, where he pointed the finger at the government in devaluing the pound or revaluing the pound at the highest level possible. And they believed that it caused a general strike. But he also had a continuing contact. And in fact, Keynes had a very close relationship with Ernie Bevin because he wanted to influence the TUC. He wanted to use the TUC in a way as a battering ram against Philip Snowden, the fairly orthodox Labour Chancellor. And so Citrine had a lot of discussions with Keynes and with Ernie Bevin.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take groups of 3 now. Angela Eagle first, and then Dennis McShane, and then Peter Brook. Angela?
Thanks very much, John. It's great to hear from all of you. I've bought the book, so I'm looking forward to the CWU delivering it to me quite soon so that I can get going on it. Obviously, we have a very soft spot in Wallasey for Walter Citrine because he grew up in Seacombe, where he's still remembered, but not remembered enough in my view. I wonder whether Jim might say a little bit more about those very early days and then just make an observation about whether the TUC and the Labour movement could learn anything from what Walter Citrine did to strengthen its position now.
Jim,
Yes.
hold that question.
Sure,
I'm going to take 2 others. Dennis McShane. You'll need to unmute yourself first, as you know. Dennis, can you hear me? You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, John, you're quite right. I thought I muted myself at the bottom. Yeah, tremendous, really interesting webinar. One of the best of lockdown. I had the privilege of going to see Walter Citrine in his retirement home, late 1970s. And it was amazing. I mean, he was still clipping every newspaper. Clip, 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 stick them down the big white sheet of paper, and then put them into different files every day, international affairs, domestic affairs, economic affairs, I don't know, Wallasey affairs. And he just had this extraordinary filing cabinet full of daily information. We all get it now off the net, but that's why he was on top of things. Very brief question, James. 1945, everything else in Britain is sort of renewed, modernized. The health service, the way we do education, social care, even a bit of the House of Lords. But the one unmodernized institution, if I may say to incredibly distinguished trade union leaders, were the trade unions. Was that Citrine's indifference to it, or did he have any ideas about modernizing and reforming trade unions, or was he just stuck, unable to move because, of course, he was the servant of the great trade union, individual trade union leaders at the time, and if they didn't want to move, nothing would happen.
Well,
Thanks,
sorry.
Dennis. Peter Brook. Peter?
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. People tell me it's an unpleasant sound when I speak, so I hope I apologize for that in advance. I don't know what the cause of it is. I'm back on Keynes, and the fact that in the late 1920s, in the run-up to the election, Keynes with the Liberal Party and Hubert Henderson had a policy of full employment. And that policy of job creation and full employment was rejected by the Labour Party. The choice, in a way, was between a sort of full employment job guarantee, which the Liberals were proposing, and unemployment benefit, which was the Labour policy. And I just wonder whether Citrine involved himself in that particular dispute.
Okay, Jim, over to you. A question from Angela Eagle about
Yes.
lessons, Dennis McShade about modernisation, and from Peter Brook on the
Yes.
question of the relationship with Keynes.
Well, I'm very grateful to Angela for, of course, getting the book. And when you do get it, you'll see one of the quotes I've picked out, that Citrine really was sorry to leave Merseyside and to leave Liverpool, and particularly Wallasey, which is where he grew up. And he swam in the river there. And generally, he was active in the Wallasey Labour Party. Of course, he stood for Parliament in 1918. He was persuaded to stand for Parliament. He didn't want to greatly, but he was a leading light in the party. And so the task fell to him. He also stood for the council, but lost again. And it was at that point he made up his mind, look, I'm going to stick to my last. I'm going to stick to the union brief. And so his record went on from there. So did we learn anything from him? I think that was one important lesson. A lot of union leaders at the time were MPs as well. And they weren't necessarily distinguished MPs, but they tried to do two things. One of Citrine's distinctive lessons from was that he focused on what it was that he had to achieve, and he went after it methodically, and as Dennis said, with that sort of ability to pull together the facts and marshal them in his speeches. He also was, I think, a great debater at the Congress, because he was one of those people who actually listens to what the opposition is saying, takes it apart and actually answers it in the course of his response. And himself and Bevin were a double act at the TUC. And so it wasn't just a question of the T&G's block vote. They actually won a lot of the votes on the sheer preparation and the sheer delivery. So that's what I would say to that. In terms of 1945 that Dennis asked about, of course, the TUC had been involved throughout the war in the Beveridge report, they were one of the biggest contributors towards the Beveridge report. Quite a number of, Citrine himself went to Philadelphia for the ILO conference, and they wanted to enshrine in the United Nations Charter the international dimension of employment rights on behalf of the trade unions. But sadly, they got shafted in 1945 by, of all people, Attlee and Bevin. Well, it was the coalition government. But so that's a story in itself, which I go into in the book. It was one of the disappointments. But after 1945, of course, so much happening. The general election, which everybody thought the Tories were going to win. And so all efforts to go in went into formation of the new Labour government and stuff. Citrine rather took a back seat because of his disappointment in San Francisco. And it was one of the reasons he left the TUC to go to the National Coal Board and then the British Electricity Authority. He was disappointed by what had happened to him. On the question of Keynes again and his full employment policies, I'm not sure that the Liberal policies were taken that seriously. Clearly, Labour, the TUC had its own programme, and Bevin was foremost in that as well in terms of pressing on the MacDonald government. But of course, it wasn't much use talking to Philip Snowden about expansion when he was about to cut unemployment benefit and indeed, in fact, to retrench as the city bankers wanted him to do. So Citrine and Bevin got into loggerheads with the government. And as we know, the cabinet split and the government came down, and MacDonald went for a national government. So there was a lot of bitterness around that. And of course, literally Labour was reduced to 46 MPs. And so they had to regroup. I was trying to say the National Council of Labour was the vehicle that they actually, and of course they would have taken on board employment policies of that kind as part of the programme. Sorry, John.
Thanks, Jim. Well, next group of questions from, first of all, Brian Kenny, then from someone whose signature is shown as Manus, got no further than that, and the next one is Alan Johnson. So Brian Kenny in the first instance.
Okay, thanks, John. Yeah, first of all, it's great to see Jim and many other previous colleagues here tonight. I've been a member of the CWU for over 50 years and a member of the Labour Party for the same amount of time. I was born in Seacombe. I still live in Wallasey, where I'm proud to say that Dame Angela is my MP. But I'm ashamed to say, until Jim contacted me a couple of weeks ago about his book, all I knew about Citrine was that apparently he'd written a book about how to chair meetings. So I suspect there's probably lots of other people out there as well who don't really know about his life. And my question basically is, what more can we all do? Well, apart from buying Jim's book, what more can we all do to spread the word out there about the fantastic work that Walter Citrine did during his life? Thanks, John.
Thanks, Brian. I think the best thing can be to buy the book, but I'm taking Jim's slogan now. Manus, please.
Hello, Jim. Manus O'Riordan here. We haven't met in decades. You're good to see you again. Did Citrine, as president of the ITUF, speak out in defense of the Spanish Republic, or did he support the non-intervention pact, which actually crippled the ability of the Republic to defend itself?
Thank you. Alan Johnson. Alan, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi, John. Jim, it's a fabulous book. I just wondered if you were aware of the importance of the ABC of chairmanship in starting the winter of discontent. It's a story I meant to tell you, but Tom Jackson told me that when he was president of the TUC, he chaired the meeting. Dennis Healy had met the Neddy Six and agreed a form of words that would have stopped the winter of discontent, according to Dennis Healy in his autobiography. But Tom was the chair and the vote was even. And Citrine said that if a vote is even, i.e. there is no majority, then it is by default not carried. Tom, the CW people were brought up with Citrine, we all knew, and procedure was very important for governing, and nowhere is it more important than the Labour movement. Tom had read his Citrine and said it's not carried, even though he had helped to draw up Dennis Healy's agreement. And even though Tom was fiercely in favour of that agreement, he stuck to Citrine. So dear old Walter, I'm afraid, caused the winter of discontent.
I was there at the time, and there might have been other reasons as well. Okay, Jim, over to you.
Right. First of all, great to see Brian Kenny as well here after a couple of years. But his question, how do we spread the word? I mean, quite apart from reading the book and so on, I think what we're trying to do is to influence today's TUC and today's Labour Party to actually see that there are important lessons, and particularly the National Council of Labour idea, where we have an open relationship, where we put the cards on the table well before an election and actually trash out a modus vivendi. And so I would think that was one key message. But yes, I will welcome any help to spread the message. And I certainly want to see it in Liverpool, particularly. There must be a special, not just a blue plaque, but there must be something special done to this lad from Merseyside, who was so distinguished as a national figure, not just a union figure. So with you, Brian, 100%. Manus, good to see you from Ireland, from Dublin. In terms of the Spanish Civil War and the Spanish Revolution, there's quite a bit in the book about it. But basically, the non-intervention pact between France and Britain, which was initially agreed, was mainly because the French government, which was then Popular Front government, and the British government pursued it. And they got all the other governments, including the Germans and the Italians, but also the Soviet Union, to sign up to it. So it was an illusion because, of course, within a very short time, the Nazis were supplying weapons and planes to the rebels. And the British and the French governments were still saying, we want non-intervention. But halfway through, I think it was about 1937, pressure within the TUC changed the policy. And I think that was very right to do. And so Citrine, very much involved in the Spanish Civil War. And a number of for instance, Caballero, who was the Spanish Prime Minister, Republican Prime Minister, was a fellow executive member with him on IFTU. So they had a lot of rapport, and he was very keen to do all he could. For instance, they tried to lobby Anthony Eden very strongly, but they failed, and he admitted, and they changed the policy. Great to see Alan Johnson here, and honoured, Alan. And again, you mentioned Tom Jackson, which of course your predecessor in our union, and it's a lovely story. But I'm sure that it isn't beyond the wit of the average trade union leader to interpret the rules in such a climactic event as a tie over whether there was going to be a settlement or not, and a form of words, to find a way to achieve a carried position on that. So Tom Jackson must hang his head for shame forevermore. God rest him. A lovely man. And so I would say Citrine's book, in fact, I've got a copy of it here somewhere. This was the original Labour chairman, if you can see it, which was published in 1921. And it's a wonderful little book, not just the rules, but it has a glossary. It has how to do it, how to pass motions, how to construct them.
Thanks very much. Let's have Keith Flett next. And then I've got something which is showing us young of Nor, but there's nothing else that's displayed apart from that. He or she will know who they are. And the third one, I'd like to ask a question about something that hasn't yet come up, and I think is rather important. Keith first.
Thank you, John. Fascinating account of Citrine, who I've only known as a sort of, yes, he was a general secretary, wrote the chair book, and so on. But what interests me, you've painted parameters of him from a syndicalist youth coming into becoming the general secretary, very much a Labour man, but seeking to widen the influence of the TUC beyond just Labour, really unavoidable, I suppose, in the 1930s after 31, but also, as we know, fiercely anti-communist. But within all that, where he actually personally or representatively, did he see himself as any kind of socialist, either individually or in the way he was operating? Where did he actually fit, in the late 20s, early 30s, into that kind of framework?
Okay, and I now, because I can now see his face, Tony Young. Tony.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, my apologies. I didn't realise I'd not switched the video on. It's good to be here amongst such august company, to meet my previous Joint General Secretary, who together we managed to form the CWU. So good to see you again, John. Well, I used to live just down the road from Citrine in Harrow Weald, and I must confess that until Jim started to talk to me about Citrine, I had no idea. I too used the ABC of chairmanship. It was where I learnt how to deal with an amendment to an amendment, which was always a tricky process, a meeting that got a bit hectic, as some of them did. So, Jim, but a little known fact that I suppose I've helped with this book really, as Jim is my allegedly a research officer for me, which enables him to access the House of Lords Library. So he may not do much research for me, but he's done the movement of power of good by producing this book. I don't know. I think, Jim, what do you think his view of the current British trade union movement and the fact that it seems to struggle in today's environment, which is not an easy environment, with a gig economy and a government that is not exactly pro the trade union movement? So do you think he'd have an answer to the sort of directions we would take and the kind of policies we should adopt?
The question I've got is that there are in the book a number of very interesting stories about what happened during the Second World War and the enormous influence that Walter Citrine had, and the fact that he was, well, he looked to me as if almost on the edge of the war cabinet. And I just wonder whether Jim would tell us a bit more about that. So first of all, about Citrine and the wider influence, and then Tony's rather uncomfortable question about what he might have thought about existing trade union action.
That's a tough one. Let me start with Keith's question. Citrine was never fiercely anti-communist, except in the sense that he was anti-communist party. He was anti-Comintern. He was anti-Moscow interfering in British trade unionism and using them. But in fact, he visited the Soviet Union 6 times: 1925, 1935, 1941, 1943, and 1945. And he was, yes, he completely abandoned and his sort of views, which were sympathetic to a more socialist outcome, I think, by the 30s. Because, of course, the Independent Labour Party, of which he grew up with, went far to the left and practically vanished up the Communist Party. So in that sense, and I do try to tease it out in the book, he had become hostile to the Communist Party, particularly in the trade unions, seeking to introduce revolution in Western Europe. But he was quite sympathetic to communists in Russia, tackling the huge problems of a backward economy and so on. So it's a complex story. By no means, Bevin was far more anti-communist than Citrine. And in fact, in the 60s, in the House of Lords, a number of his speeches, he mused on the communist influence in the electricians and in other, which was not at all as you would expect. Tony, good to see you, Tony. Yes, and I should say that my fee as researcher should be with you quite soon. But Citrine would have had a strong view about the current situation, because after when he became chair of the British Electricity Authority, he gave up politics. He wouldn't even sit in the House of Lords because he thought there was a conflict of interest. But as soon as he got back in 1958 onwards, he was back asserting his usual strong Labour position, and his most distinctive intervention, I thought, was to support the postal workers' strike in 1971. And he made a very strong intervention, calling for a court of inquiry there. So, but he was always, as was said earlier, Dennis, I think it was, he kept up to date. He was always taking out the clippings and kept up to date. And he would have had a view as to where we've gone wrong. And it wouldn't have been a simple view. It would have been, but he was first and last a trade union leader. And he had some skepticism about all politicians. And he saw many of them at very close range. But at the same time, he had a great respect for the political process and the necessity of it. So complex story, but he would have, yes, I think he would have had some very interesting things to say to Keir Starmer. And I say the idea of the National Council of Labour would, I think, be one of his great legacies to the Labour Party and the trade unions. Finally, John, you're so right that he was edging near the War Cabinet. When Citrine was asked to join the Labour government in 1940, the coalition government, by Churchill and Attlee, but he declined. He said, I'm going to stay with the TUC because my job there is more important. Ernie will become minister, and he did, and performed, as we know, quite well. But when Churchill saw him afterwards, he said, look, I'm really disappointed that you didn't take up my offer. But as you're adamant, instead, I'm going to make you a Privy Councillor. Now, many people don't realize what a Privy Councillor means. And he said it had the status of a cabinet minister. It had access to every government minister, including the Prime Minister. And Ernie Bevan once told a story. He said that Walter Citrine was the only person he knew who could march up to Downing Street, knock on the door, and ask to see the Prime Minister. And if he was told that the Prime Minister was otherwise engaged, he would be in a high dudgeon that he wasn't immediately admitted. So he was on that close terms with Churchill, and they sat together in Downing Street during the Blitz, and Churchill refused to move from Downing Street, and they sang and recited the poetry of their youth, patriotic poetry, like "You Mariners of England" and so on. So he was very much, I think, very close to, admired, but yet very strong, the Union man, rather than anybody's patsy. Does that answer, John?
Yes, thank you. Two more, John Lloyd and Philip Murphy. John?
There I am. Yes, is that okay?
Yeah, you hear you now.
Lovely. My name's John Lloyd, and 30 years ago, I wrote a history of the Electricians' Union, in which I, like many other distinguished colleagues tonight, first really discovered Citrine. And I've been so pleased that Jim's book has paid attention to the early experiences of Citrine in creating the titan that Jim's book later describes, that we are all becoming familiar with. I sometimes wonder, looking at these screens, that there are some other colleagues here whose early lives might repay a similar study. As far as I can see, Citrine on Merseyside's early experience filters throughout his whole distinguished public career in three main ways. In Birkenhead, the branches finished in utter uproar in the shipbuilding fellows on Merseyside. I know so many of you will find this surprising, that Merseyside shipyard workers are argumentative to the point of falling over each other. And Citrine's ABC of chairmanship has its genesis in putting those branches straight so that they could actually finish their meetings. And from 1914 onwards, the early draft of the chairmanship book ended up as part of the ETU's rule book as an appendix. Secondly, his role in sorting out centralized finance, which picks up one of Tony Young's interests in what would a modern Citrine say. He was very wary of the misuse of local funds, particularly to publish rogue post-Russian Revolution local journals, by using branch and regional funding. And thirdly, his distress with the Communist Party, as Jim points out, was not the political ideology necessarily, but the personal abuse and downright misuse of trade union resources unsupported by majority views. And for people who really want to know what he thought about them, do read My Finnish Diary, which was a Penguin special in 1940 after he'd been to Finland, where in the midst of exposing Soviet-Russian lies, he was wandering around bomb sites, commenting on the revealed high standard of the electrical ducting in bombed premises. Once a skilled man, always a skilled man. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, John, for that characteristic ETU approach to these things. Philip?
Jim, I've got a question about political biography, and it's partly comes from personal experience. That you take on a political biography often because, as the name implies, you're interested in the political career and the political history, but inevitably you get drawn into the personal because it's a biography, and the personal is often full of surprises and sometimes things that you don't necessarily want to get drawn into. Might be quite difficult. How did you negotiate that, and what in broad terms do you think was the relationship between the personal and the political, because that's what biography is after all exploring?
Thank you, Philip. After Jim's answered those two questions, I'm going to ask a final reflection, and then of course the last word will have to go to Jim. So first of all, Jim, John, Lloyd and Philip's questions, very different questions and both rather difficult. Over you go.
Yes, very good to see John Lloyd. And of course, John is a distinguished author of the history of the EETPU, now in Unite. And I would recommend that book also, because I used it quite a bit in terms of exploring the early days of the electricians and their various rows and so on. He mentions particularly the Birkenhead shipping uproar and the genesis of the ABC. And it's so true, but it wasn't, I mean, it was a set of notes and it became a book by 1921, which was an indication of how Citrine worked. He wrote so many things in his life and he wrote them very well. I would recommend his biography, his autobiography, 2 volumes, Men and Work, 2 Careers, as a splendid example of that. You mentioned, and you reminded me, because I didn't mention it, his sorting out of the union's finances. In Manchester, 1920, 1922, he just got a job as the elected national officer. He suddenly found the union was practically bankrupt, and he would soon be out of a job if he didn't do something about it. So his view was that a lot of money was draining through the local branches, who had control entirely of the subscriptions. And so he got the union and persuaded them, and he went to every branch himself to change. And they did change. And they saved the union and put it back on a sounder footing. That was one of the things that commended him to the TUC, his ability to understand the finances, which he did again part-time through night school. Yes, and also, I haven't dwelt on the personal abuse he had to put up with. From the moment he published his 1927 booklet about the minority movement, he was followed and chased by the CP and all their front organizations. And he had a tremendous difficulty in a number of libel actions. And of course, they never got anything from it because the Daily Worker always shifted its ownership. And so, for instance, he was driven off a platform in Hyde Park, booed, and the singing of the Internationale in the 1930s. And, you know, he was pilloried and followed in that way. Herbert Morrison, and I had a quote from him, who was the former Home Secretary and a friend of Citrine's. He said that Citrine, I'm finding it, but I'm not finding it, so I let it go. Oh yes, here we are. He said he called him one of the most honest, analytical, and objective minds in the British Labour movement. That is why he is hated by the communists. For the men who will not cringe to them is blacklisted and made the subject of abusive attack and interrogation at public meetings. And so I think that was so true. Phil, looking at the question of political biography, a very deep question, obviously. Citrine had a number of eccentricities. He was very much into palmistry. And he consulted a palmist in Birmingham, one meeting he went to, when he had a half an hour to spare. He wandered into a tent and he was told his fortune. He interpreted from this that he would get the TUC job because he was told that he would be going to a place where there was a high building with class and et cetera, et cetera. So he was, I think, to an extent, he had personal idiosyncrasies which could be explored at a different type of meeting. But I think the question of one of he was such an intense individual. He was always reading his books. He was always reading his report. I think he neglected his youngsters at an early age, and I think he regretted it from some of the things that happened subsequently, which I can't obviously get into now. But he realized it in terms of his wife, Doris, and he thought, look, I'm always abroad. I'm always traveling here and there and everything, and she's at home in Harrow, bringing up the kids. So he made it a vow that she would come with him on all his meetings from there on, and he did. And so they had a wonderful relationship. She died in 1973, is buried in Harrow Weald Cemetery. And when he died in Devon in 1983, he was brought back to Harrow and buried with her in the grave. Sadly, there isn't even a gravestone. So I think the TUC has some responsibility to do better in terms of to honor this gentleman who was such an outstanding leader.
On final reflections?
Well, I'm really pleased, first of all, that so many people have come and that it's been such a distinguished audience, and we've had such a useful discussion. Obviously, I couldn't cover a fraction of his life, and even the book doesn't, you know, as with all great men. But I hope you will dip into it and see what you think, and that it will sort of inform discussions today on, because a lot of our trade union leaders had equally, they took great responsibilities, they took great abuse of them, and it was a thankless job in the end. And we don't as a labour movement honour them sufficiently.
Well, either John Monks or I should ask you, Jim, at this point, to tell us how everybody can get their hands on this magnificent book and how much it will cost. So this is your moment to do the hard sell.
Yes, indeed. And I think that Gemma is already flagging up some details, but it's available on Amazon online and Hives. It's available in a number of major bookshops, including Bagwell's, the depository, the book depository. We're having some difficulty with Waterstones as regards their algorithm and so on. but it's available in those major stuff. £24.99, which is a snip of 400 pages.
John?
Yeah, well, I'm grateful to Jim for this interest in Walter Citrine. You thought, well, I knew he was a great man, and I think looking at the number of people who are on this call who've been TUC employees or close to the TUC, there's a little bit of Citrine in all of us in terms of the way that the organization's ethos developed and so on, and the respect for process and administration. And I'm grateful, though, that Jim has taken us well beyond Citrine and his files into the real leadership that he showed on crucial things on so many occasions. He was a great person, and we join with Jim in celebrating his contributions. Well done, Jim. I hope people will buy it. It's well worth it. It's entertaining. There's lots of anecdotes told with that Irish twinkle that Jim can bring to any story he's telling.
Thank you very much, John. Well, the greatest tribute to Walter Citrine that I can manage is to finish the meeting on time.
Yes.
So as a tribute to his chairmanship rather than to mine. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I hope you'll buy the book. I hope you'll think very carefully about some of the themes that have been raised this evening and are raised in the book. So thank you very much. Glad to see so many of you here. Thanks again.